this video, I want to start with a question. What is the First Amendment to the Constitution? I'm going to venture to guess that 99% of you or more said it was freedom of speech, press, assembly, and so forth. Well, you would be wrong. There's a largely forgotten and largely unknown First Amendment, which actually was called, back when the original Bill of Rights was passed by the House and Senate, was called Article the First. And let's keep in mind, before I tell you what Article the First is, let's keep in mind why the Bill of Rights came into being. They drafted the Constitution, and what they did then is they sent, after the ratification, they sent it out to the states to be discussed, to be analyzed, to be looked at from every camera angle possible. And in fact, the Federalist Papers, which was a series of newspaper articles, dozens of them that went into the newspaper, that actually were articulating why the Constitution should be supported by the various states, because again, it had to be ratified. Well, as part of that, even going into that, there were some concerns about protections of individuals in the Constitution, because many things were not specifically enumerated. So a lot of what came out of the state conventions was specifically a desire to have a Bill of Rights specifically enumerated and amended to the Constitution so that all the protections that we enjoy today, and can you imagine, just imagine for a moment, this country without freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petitioning, thinking about the Second Amendment of the right to bear arms. You think about unreasonable search and seizure. You think about double jeopardy and self-incrimination and protection from cruel and unusual punishment, and all the different things in the Bill of Rights that were so near and dear to the people back then and have continued to be near and dear to us today. The government would have encroached so much further on the rights and liberties of citizens if we didn't have the Bill of Rights. But do you know what the First Amendment was that came out of Congress in 1789? Was a specific formula which was supposed to define what the House of Representatives would look like as the population grew. And here's what it basically said, that for the first, when the House is below 100 members, which by the way it passed in the very first census of 1792, it went to 105, but it said up to 100, we get a representation of 1 for every 30,000 people. Between 100 and 200, the ratio ought to be 1 for every 40,000 people. And then after the House gets above 200, it ought to be 1 for every 50,000. And the reason that amendment came, and by the way, that was the first amendment of the 12, because really the freedom of speech, press, and so on, that was Article the 3rd, which became Article the 1st because that's what got passed, and Amendments 1 and 2 did not pass, which is a whole other history I don't have time to get into. But the reason that was first is because it tied to what the people in the states thought was a protection of their liberty. They were afraid that if you granted the federal government a chance to restrict the members in the United States House, that abuses and usurpations and ultimately potentially tyranny and loss of liberty would ensue. Because the thinking was, well, once you give people power, unless you have some kind of a mandate to have the House continue to grow, which means that as you have more representatives coming into the House, the less power each individual would have, unless you can hardwire and articulate that in writing in the Constitution, you would have the abuses which we now clearly see today. 100 years ago, the House was frozen in size, and we not only have a lack of appropriate representation, but we have massive inequity, which we've talked about in earlier videos. So it was so important to the protection of individual rights to have a House of Representatives which was going to continue to be district sizes small enough that would be in touch with and close to the people. Now, it turned out that it fell one vote short, one state short of actually being ratified. And in fact, the Second Amendment, Article the 2nd, became our 27th Amendment, which basically says that Congress can't give themselves a pay raise unless you have another election of the House. There has to be another session before a pay raise would go into effect. So isn't that interesting that they were so worried that the text of the Constitution in its current form was defective enough, which gave enough discretion, which clearly the federal government has taken advantage of, so that districts that should have stayed smaller have now gotten to be what I call supersized and so big that we're not getting the kind of representation, and we're certainly not getting the equality of representation that we deserve. So interesting history on Article the First, but realizing that even back in the adoption of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, this was on the minds of the framers to make sure that we had proper and appropriate representation in Congress. So if you want to learn more, I would encourage you to go to a website that has a wealth of information. It's called 30,000.org. That's 30-1000.org. And there's so much information on there, and one of the items is a pamphlet as well as a fairly lengthy paper that gets into all the minutiae about Article the First, and it's quite a fascinating history lesson. So I encourage you to take a look at that, as well as you can go to our website at apportionment.us.